Thank you very much to Hugh Webster and all our presenters for that very interesting session. I think you've given us a good understanding of not only the various serious challenges we face, but also some of the great opportunities we now have to move forward together to address these challenges. We will open up for panel discussions. I can't see any on events there just yet, but given for this brief moment in time I have the microphone and thus the power, I'm going to take MC prerogative and ask the first question. And this very much leverages off just the last presentation. So all the speakers have highlighted the importance of relationships and human interaction. NATO's worked as an alliance for over 70 years, and we can learn a lot from observing its conduct and operations. However, multilateralism also brings about challenges. Do our speakers have any thoughts on or comments they'd like to share about the complexities of working across a broad coalition with diverse partners, including industry, and how best we can overcome those challenges?
Well, maybe if I may, I think if there is a time where it's become really clear what the importance is of an ecosystem of the defense forces, industry, knowledge institutes, universities, and that in that bigger international arena, and I think that time is now. I see it in my Air Force in making steps in developing new capabilities. If you do those from the get-go in that ecosystem together, in thinking about a new capability, designing it, developing it, building it. For instance, when we brought our first nanoset to space last summer, this was exactly the process we went through. We basically stood around this new product, this new capability, and built it from scratch. And we're able to sustain it together in that ecosystem as well. I think that is the way ahead to rapidly not only think about developing new capabilities, but also fielding them really quickly. So I think working together in that, so closely together, I think is really key. And I think that goes back to your words as well, that you just mentioned.
Oh, look, I think from an industry perspective, the programs that we have that have succeeded have been based on the success of the relationships. And ultimately that comes down to understanding each other's equities, walking the mile in someone else's shoes, so to speak, understanding the challenges and seeing how you can adapt to help those challenges, because ultimately it's together that industry and defence can help succeed with these complex programs.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess my comment further would be multilateralism shouldn't be implied to mean you're either for us or you're against us. You know, we need to steer away from this binary option that unless you're part of a multilateral thing, but now you're part of it, there's an obligation on you to do something else. We need to accept that multilateralism as a way of ecosystems interfacing is a way of keeping a higher level of shared understanding, but from time to time each of those intersecting ecosystems will respond in their own way, and we just need to acknowledge that as a fact. But if one part of the system changes, the natural consequences are the others will react and change in their own way, whether they're part of it or not, because of that interconnectedness. So I think we need to avoid establishing this binary notion that multilateralism is a pact or an alliance. It's not. It's just another way of collaborating.
And I guess the other thing I'll just add from my perspective, and less from a multinational, multilateral perspective, but just within one ecosystem from a national Inc. perspective. If I think about just over the last few years in getting the New Zealand space industry up and running in a very, very short period of time, I think what has been really crucial is just having so many interested parties who actually all want it to succeed from a national level. So looking at a loftier goal than just the single organisation that everybody comes from. So, you know, for us that started with Rocket Lab, but it involved universities, it involved creating a national regulatory agency. It was defence, and then ultimately the source of skills. But everybody is kind of looking at this from a national perspective and wanting it to work from a loftier level.
So for Air Vice-Marshal Clark, in addition to globalisation, do you think Antarctic competition is making New Zealand's area of interest increasingly more strategically relevant?
Yes, I do. A previous Prime Minister from the 1980s in New Zealand once mischievously described New Zealand as a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. Look, most people haven't looked there for most of history. It seemed largely irrelevant, and increasingly it is more relevant. We have seen just over the last 10 to 15 years more countries establishing more permanent bases on Antarctica. We have seen Antarctica becoming more accessible because of climate change. And we have also seen the Antarctic treaty system increasingly challenged, just as one of those sets of rules and norms, as we're seeing others being bent and challenged within the global environment. That too is happening in the Antarctic treaty system. Now that doesn't mean that it's an emergency at this stage, but it is becoming increasingly relevant, and I think certainly from a New Zealand perspective, and I know from a number of other countries represented here today, we're having to pay more attention and not taking security and adherence to those norms and rules that we've had just for granted.
It's a great question, sir, and I think it's important to reflect as well that we can't allow ourselves to be diverted by the latest crisis. And as someone mentioned, just not looking at the last war as well, and there's a number of other elements that play into that. And I know General Luyt also mentioned terrorism as well, and keeping our eye on that. So terrorism, Antarctica, the hard power, and the many other things that we still need to be attuned to, not either trying to fight the last war or anticipate the next. Sir, do you have another question on your phone?
Well, if I may, while you're looking for a smart question, there's just something, a question that I have maybe to the other members of the panel. One of the issues that we're looking at in Europe is because of the crisis that we're facing on our eastern borders, there's a big realization that we need to up our spending. You've read about it in the media. There's a number of nations that are now stepping up to their requirement of spending 2% of the GDP on defense spending. So you see that happening in a lot of nations, including my nation, so that's a positive thing. But how is there lessons that you can share in this region with us as Europeans on so how do you go about this? Because it's one thing to add a lot of budget, in the Dutch case, that could be an increase of about 50% of our defense budget that we're facing in the next couple of years. So how do we ensure that we turn extra budget into new capabilities, growth of capabilities? So how do we achieve speed there in that sense, and mass? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on some lessons on how you do that here in Australia and the region?
Smoke and mirrors. I think the true essence of it is, as pointed out through industry as well, and as we were briefly talking about before this session started as well there, Sir, is that I think if you look through the lens of mobilisation and sustainment, you start to understand what are the things you need to have in place that's going to make anything endure over time. And so having the adaptive mechanisms to change is important, but in a large influx of money, which is great, but it's a cash cow that you shouldn't just eat at the one sitting. It's what are the longer term things that are going to make your process repeatable and sustainable. And a lot of those things have to do with, I think over time, institutions and communities of practice. And as we say in our Air Force as well, creating a community of practice to actually facilitate those conversations is arguably more important to sustain than actually the delivery of a widget afterwards as well. And so, and that I think was reflected on former speakers this morning as well when they're talking about not what to think, but how to think. So also I think that we probably undersell the ability of humans to adapt. And from a military perspective, I'm a senior officer, so only senior officers have good ideas, right? But the key point remains is that I think we are overly cautious in terms of our perceptions about what the workforce can do to actually adapt and change, because humans are inherently more adaptable than we give them credit for. And I think we need to actually, it's not risk, it's actually just acceptance that, well, we can probably advance some of these ideas and introductions to service as a more of a stretch target than we probably have cautiously thought in the past, because people really don't know what they're capable of from time to time until they're pushed.
From an industry perspective, increased defence spending, obviously you can acquire more platforms, but ultimately it flows into defence industry. Defence industry in a resource sense only has a fixed capacity to be able to spend that. And so the more lead time you can give in terms of signals like roadmaps or visions or whatever you want to call them, they can give us the intent to get prepared, if you will. When it comes to actually doing the work, reconsidering postures to do with appetite for failure, risk that technology doesn't come off, those kind of things are also things to think through in terms of how do you accelerate defence spending.
If I may just add to that one about roadmaps and flight plans, they are really valuable. We just need to, I think, also adjust our temporal perspectives about how far forward we look. In the military appreciation process, we talk about defining end states. But if you blindly drive to an end state that's too far down, what you give yourself is a constraint and an inability to adapt and change. And so I don't think end states actually exist. They are just next states. Yeah. So it's having a horizon sufficiently close enough that you see things changing in the real world that give you the flexibility to adapt organisationally. And that's, I guess, the criticism of the CLC or the other processes right now that we have, our life cycle, is that process is just too long. But if you constrain and say it can't be any more than 4 years, as an example, in terms of how far you think, then you straight away have started an institutional culture that is habitually looking to change more rapidly.
Thanks, sir. I think we have time just for one last question, one from the audience, and it's posed to Acost, sir. Do you think the broader defence enterprise is adequately considering the next war? And do you think we should increasingly adapt to high-end threats through asymmetry?
Well, I'll talk about the Australian Defence Enterprise and the Australian Defence Force. So there's broadly 3 types of warfare you can conduct. There's attrition warfare, there's manoeuvre warfare, and then there's moral warfare. Moral warfare is kind of like guerrilla warfare. The size of the Australian Defence Force is of such a scale that we're not in the game of attrition. And we're not about to overthrow a government, so we're probably not in guerrilla warfare. So we are firmly a manoeuvrist warfare type of philosophical outfit. If that's the case, then the dynamics of manoeuvre, which looks to leverage asymmetries and looks to leverage balances, imbalances, and also looks to leverage transient advantages, that's the force that we are as an enterprise. So we should be exploring those asymmetries off axis, but as I spoke about from a Boyd perspective, there needs to be a variety of those asymmetries as well. And so this is also where we need to steer away from the one golden widget that's going to solve all our problems to there's a multitude, there's a fruit salad we get to choose from, and all of those might be useful or not at any one particular time, and are we willing and adaptable to use them over time? So high end for me is probably, even that is a constraint in terms of the way we're thinking. It's just ranges of responses to adapt to either survive or to thrive.
Maybe if I may add, I think when we talk about different scenarios and try to imagine, what are some of the scenarios that we may be facing in the future, I think, first of all, those are hard to predict. I think over the last year, we've seen a couple of scenarios unfold which I think nobody really anticipated, like what happened in Afghanistan, very short time, doing a lot of NEO operations with a lot of nations together. What's happening right now in the Ukraine. And so I think, when we talk about different scenarios, being prepared for that, we talk about the tip of the spear a lot. And we heard about that, of course, this morning, when this whole story, that's not just about the tip of the spear, it's also the whole spear itself. But I think being able to to be able to provide an answer, a push-button answer in a wide range of scenarios, I think that's going to be the likely future. And then multiple scenarios at the same time. And that is actually what we see happening. So being able not to have the best toolbox to do that, but also to be able to sustain that with enough personnel in a workforce, in a job market that is very competing. So having a workforce that is up to the task, but also having the logistics and the sustainment in place together with industry to support that. I think that is something that we overlook easily, and because it's not maybe the sexy part of the discussion, but it is very much part of the discussion in being able to answer a multitude of scenarios at the same time. I think that's going to be the name of the game as well.
It's kind of, as Dr. Carl mentioned this morning, it's a complex system. It's not linear. And in order to leverage a complex system is to either be aware of your parts of the system and strengthen them, but equally so, that's like multiple centres of gravity, and from a countering perspective, that's what you also look to target as well, because that drives increased friction from an adversary perspective as well. So understanding the complexity of the system and understanding the variety of responses will actually slow your adversary down as well. So once again, it's not one thing, it's many things directed, but noting that when you find the advantage, you can exploit it.
Right, thank you. Thank you to all our speakers for the discussion and to the audience for posing those questions as well. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel.